How are you doing today? You having a good
I'm
day?
fine, thank you. I'm on sabbatical,
Yeah.
so no complaints.
Good.
And you?
Good. Yeah. It's nice to finally get to meet you and have a chat. I was recommended by a listener named Zach, who is a huge fan of yours, and that triggered this conversation because there's a lot of desire to have discussions about some of these things that people have historically pushed to the side,
Huh? Yeah.
as you're well aware.
So let me ask you a personal question. So I associate you with the Eastern Church? Are you Orthodox?
Yeah.
Yeah? Antiochene or
OCA.
OCA?
Yeah.
Do you have you been to St. Vladimir's, for example, to study?
No, I went to school at Liberty University before I converted to Orthodoxy.
Really? What
Yeah.
decade?
I didn't go to right out of high school. I was a late entry, so I didn't go to college until I was like 25. But that was like 2014, 15, around there, I think.
Did you study with Gary Habermas?
No, I did it online.
Oh, you did online.
Yeah, but I didn't have him. No. But
did you do religion, philosophy, or what?
Yeah, religion, theology. Yeah.
Okay.
But of course, most of my time there, I had been growing more interested in Eastern Orthodoxy in the middle of my academic studies, which kind of derailed the whole process.
Yeah.
I was considering being like a pastor in the Reformed tradition. And then I started reading the Church Fathers and reading the Eastern thinkers and Origen, and really just finding them way more convincing. And so I eventually realized that was not going to be a path for me. And so, yeah, I eventually became Orthodox. And yeah, I've been Orthodox since like 2017.
So are you a lay person or a deacon or?
Yeah, lay.
Okay. All right. Is that going to stay that way?
Yeah, I think so. I considered the priest route, but I pretty quickly realized it wasn't for me.
Okay.
So now I'm just doing my own thing as a layperson. What is your Christian faith background, and what were some of the beliefs and afterlife beliefs that you were raised in?
So I was raised initially in a mainstream to liberal Presbyterian church. And as far as I know, nothing was said about an afterlife or the world to come or eschatology.
Really?
Then when I was in junior high, my parents went to an even more liberal church, which was a congregational church. And I do remember the pastor once preaching on hell, and the gist of it was there's no such thing, so just don't worry about it. That was the extent of my eschatology, I suppose, within the church. But I grew up with a father who we would now call sort of a new ager. He was a Presbyterian. He went to church. Thought of himself as a Christian, but he read all sorts of things outside the box. And I remember reading books on reincarnation when I was in junior high and high school because he had those in his library. I even remember a book by Ian Stevenson that I ran across once.
Do you remember some of those books, what he was reading?
I remember there were a lot of Edgar Cayce books, if you know anything about Edgar Cayce, and some books by mediums. I read those, had no idea what to make of them. I don't know what he made of them. They were just there in his library, and we really didn't talk about them. I just read them, put them back on the shelf, and that was it. But then in my last year of high school, I ended up in an evangelical church. So I left my parents' church, and I hung around with evangelicals for a year. And that's where I first ran into people who really believed in hell. It was central. It was important to what they were about. They were also dispensationalists and thought that Jesus was coming really soon, like maybe next year. So I spent a year with them. And then I went off to college and discovered modern philosophy and modern theology, and been doing my own thing ever since.
Hearing you talk, I'm very familiar with all of that because that's where I came out of. Dispensationalists, premillennial, end times, left behind, all of that.
Yep.
is everywhere in low church evangelicalism. I know we have a lot of overlapping interests, and Origen is one of them. What drew you to the writings of like Origen, the Alexandrians, the Eastern traditions? And talk about that.
So I ran across Origen for the first time in graduate school, and a professor for a class in church history assigned on first principles or on first things, and I read it, and I just fell in love. I fell in love with the large mind, with the freedom to speculate. Origen himself wanted to be a faithful son of the church, and in his own mind he was, but he knew that within Christian doctrine, there were all sorts of things that he was free to talk about or speculate on, or he would say, do research on. I'm going to research this. And candidly, I fell in love with his universalism. And I also, later on, as I continued to read Origen, I fell in love with what I would call his honesty. And by that, I mean, if you read him, let's say his commentary on the Gospel of John, he's upfront and candid that you can't harmonize everything in John with the synoptics. And, the tendency of most Christians traditionally has been to say we've got to harmonize these. So if the episode of Jesus in the temple is at the beginning in John 2, and it's then later in Mark, in the last week in Mark 11, well, it must have happened twice. The same event, pretty much the same event, happened twice. Origen just says, no, they're not bound to chronology. They can move things around. And he will even say, sometimes I can't take this literally, and so I have to understand it figuratively. I think that Christian history would have been better off if they had followed Origen on this rather than end up with a sort of ridiculous harmonization that you often get later on. Actually, if you look at 19th century Germany, one of the things that makes liberalism confident about itself, liberal Christianity, is that the harmonists, or the people who harmonize, are just obviously wrong. It's easy to debunk them, and so what do we do now? You wouldn't have had this investment in harmonization, theological investment, if the church had followed Origen. So for all sorts of reasons, Origen builds a world. He's like Augustine or Plato or Kant. It's this universe that he's made, and it's a Christian universe, and I just think it's brilliant. It's wonderful to live in, and I like Origen very much. In fact, as you know, Origen was not canonized. He was a heretic rather than a saint. But I have 2 or 3 icons of Origen. So they're illegal icons. They're not canonical icons, but I have them.
The McGuckin one?
Pardon?
The one by Eileen McGuckin?
Yeah.
John McGuckin's wife?
Yep.
Yeah. That's a great one. Yeah, I think it's also ironic that you have the liberal scholarship on the one side that are kind of following in Origen's footsteps when it comes to like biblical criticism. But then you also have the other side of the argument, like the people who try to harmonize everything are also following Origen in what he said it's in the Philokalia of Origen, where he talks about the many books of the Bible being one book, essentially written by the Holy Spirit. And so they have this idea of like there being one author, and then that leads to what like contemporary evangelicals think about the Bible. And so you have even both sides of that debate are kind of dependent on things that Origen had said.
Well, so one of the things I always tell my students is you wouldn't have Augustine without Origen. So Augustine doesn't like many things about Origen. He knows about him. But if you read the Confessions, Augustine says that the big stumbling block for him was taking the book of Genesis literally, right? It made no sense to him. And then he heard some sermons by Ambrose, who was allegorizing. But Ambrose is getting this from Origen. So Augustine's conversion is really due to Origen. So, yeah, there's a case where Origen is influential and important and has an impact even by somebody who's saying, no, he was a heretic. We don't like this guy.
Yeah, that's actually a big reason why I chose Ambrose of Milan as my patron saint. He kind of brought the Alexandrians to the Latin world. So how would you define death? according to historical Christian traditions?
So maybe you'll have to clarify it. But first of all, I don't think I've actually thought of this as a topic. That is, I've never worried about how to define death or how the Christian tradition does. I could say, as you know, that there's a minority view within the church, 2 or 3 church fathers, and later on some people in the Middle Ages and Seventh-day Adventists today who believe in soul sleep, so that for them, death means the end of consciousness, right? You're just in the grave, and then later on you come back to life at the resurrection. But the dominant tradition has said that the body dies, but the self does not, and that awareness, or the inner person, or whatever you want to call it, the soul, spirit, continues on. Maybe it goes to heaven, maybe it goes to hell. But in that sense, there is no death because there's no extinction of consciousness at any point. By the way, I'm on board with that personally, theologically. Some people will say, even some people here at my seminary, I teach at Princeton Seminary, will say that the Christian view is the Hebrew view, which is the view that when you're dead, and resurrection is the only thing that matters. It's the only way to eternal life. So when you're dead, there's no soul with Jesus in heaven. There's just a body in the ground until the last day. I don't think that's a New Testament idea, and I don't even think it's a Hebrew Bible idea. I think the Jews in general were dualists of a sort. That is, they believed that some part of the personality was in the underworld or in Sheol or whatever when the body was no longer functioning. So I personally see a sort of dualism, if that's the right word, running throughout the tradition. And
well, Josephus talks about the different metaphysical beliefs of like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and how they differed. Like the Sadducees had this basically annihilationist position that when the body dies, the soul also dies, and the Pharisees did not believe that.
So for me, this is difficult to figure out what the Sadducees thought. So some people do present them as annihilationists. I would guess that they were rather people who believed in an old-fashioned view of Sheol, and to be in Sheol was to be a ghost and not to be alive. It was not real life. And the Pharisees, by contrast, believed both in some sort of better world upon death and also in a resurrection, or at least I think most of them did. Again, the Sadducees are really hard to figure out. You might remember from Acts that at one point it said the Sadducees don't believe in angels, right? And you think, this is impossible because their canon included the Torah, and the Torah is full of angels. There's no way they didn't believe in angels. So people have wondered, did Luke make a mistake? Or one option is that it's very common in Jewish and Christian sources to think of the afterlife as being angelic, or of human beings as becoming angels. So maybe what it's saying is they didn't believe in an angelic afterlife. They didn't believe that things got better. They just believed you went down to Sheol. So I'm not sure what the Sadducees thought. We don't have, to our knowledge, any books written by Sadducees. So we have only things that outsiders or opponents said, which is, that's always very dangerous.
I've never heard that interpretation before that you mentioned about the Sadducees not believing in a resurrection in that way. Where does that come from?
Where does that come from? If you're asking me for a chapter verse, I can't give that to you. That's just my sense after all these years of having read this, that, and the other thing. It's my own.
Because I've only ever seen like the annihilationist position on like what they believed. So I'm just unfamiliar with it.
If they believed in annihilationism, then that would be very interesting, and I think really, really strange myself within a Jewish context. Everybody believed in some sort of afterlife, even if it's dark and miserable and ghostly. So I would be surprised.
Because I had a question about what the word resurrection in the text means to different people in the New Testament. If Josephus is saying that the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife, then that would really influence our perspective on the arguments that the Sadducees were having with Jesus about the resurrection, because it could also mean resurrection in the sense of the rising of the soul from the body in an afterlife, So it's hard to figure out.
Okay, so I have done a lot of work on this, and I believe that the only Jewish text in which resurrection language is used of the soul is in a pre-Christian book called Jubilees, which is from a couple of centuries at least before early Christianity. There is a passage in Jubilees that may have this idea, but I haven't found it anywhere else. And I think that when Pharisees and early Christians are using resurrection language, they are thinking of bodies. Now, they may be like Paul, who think that upon resurrection, these bodies are transformed into something else. But I think they're still thinking of bodies and not just souls.
Yeah. In my readings of those, the minutia of that, it seems almost like almost a splitting hairs. Like what one person thinks about the soul isn't necessarily in opposition to what Paul's saying about a resurrected body.
So I think Paul was a dualist. And I think in 2 Corinthians 5, he has the sense of being with Jesus, even though the resurrection has not happened yet. I think that's clear in Philippians, where he's going to leave and be with Jesus, but he's going to be dead. He's not talking about resurrection. He's talking about what Christians traditionally term the interim period, the period between an individual's death and the parousia, or the resurrection, the second coming, last judgment, and so on. So Paul is, in my judgment, a sort of dualist. And so he can have a soul go to heaven to be with Jesus, because that's where Jesus is. Jesus is at the right hand of the Father in heaven, but at the same time look forward to resurrection. And if I had to guess, I would guess that was the typical view of the Pharisees. And I think that's probably also the view of most early Christians.
Yeah, let's talk about what the Pharisees believed, because Josephus says, so this is in Jewish Wars 2:8-14 and Antiquities of the Jews 18:1-3. He says that the Pharisees believed in some form of reincarnation, but doesn't give enough details to help us definitively say which kind. He says that the Pharisees believed in the immortality of the soul, but that only the righteous souls are moved, quote, to other bodies, and, quote, have the power to revive and live again. But the wicked are subject to eternal punishment in a subterranean spiritual prison inside the earth. If one only read the section from Antiquities of the Jews, one might think of a revival of the righteous soul in the same body that they died in. But then in Jewish Wars, he says, quote, move to other bodies, which can only mean either, I would say, A, the conventional sense of reincarnation, where good souls are allowed to assume new fleshly avatars on earth, B, the Pauline sense of being given a new spiritual body not composed of flesh and blood. I suppose the probability of the latter view might be greater since Paul was a Reformed Pharisee. But what are your thoughts?
So I think Josephus is being intentionally vague. So you presented either this or that. I don't think it's either or for Josephus. If you look at the secondary literature, the modern scholarly literature on those passages, what they'll say is that Josephus is trying to make Judaism intelligible to a Greco-Roman audience that could sympathize with the notion of reincarnation, so that Josephus is actually assimilating the traditional notion of resurrection to reincarnation, or at least using language in such a way that a Greek reader could read that into the text, and he would want that to happen. Beyond that, though, Josephus says that, he was trained as a Pharisee, and the Pharisees, from what I would gather, or I should say some of them, did in fact think like Paul. So if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, you'll find the analogy of the seed. You plant the seed, and then what comes is very, very different. You can find that in the rabbis, and the rabbis are heirs to, in part, the Pharisaic tradition. So I think that's already there. The rabbis can also speak of glory, doxa, kavod, the glory of these resurrection bodies, which are very, very different. There's also a text from the late 1st century known as Second Baruch. And here the dead literally get up out of their graves, but then they're radically transformed and they become like stars, they become angels, they live on high and so on. So the point here is that Paul's not the only person to have this notion of a radical transformation. So it's not zombie land for Paul, right? As it is in a lot of Christian art. A lot of Christian art, it's people getting out of their tombs. Skeletons come out of tombs and they get the flesh on and they walk around and they're just like they always were. Paul's idea that there's some kind of really radical change, I would guess may have been there already in his Pharisaic tradition.
Yeah, that sounds to be the case to me too. I will say that I'm aware of the scholarly perspective that Josephus was kind of accommodating the Romans.
Uh-huh.
But there's also other scholarly positions on it as well, who do think the Pharisees did hold a belief in a kind of reincarnation. There's a new volume out of Brill called Reincarnation in Clement of Alexandria. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't seen that.
It's really interesting. It's by a Philo scholar who also wrote about reincarnation in Philo. He seems to believe that he's more convinced by the reincarnation arguments. So there is still scholarly debate on this, I guess.
That's interesting. Does he find evidence of reincarnation in any rabbinic texts?
I'm only like maybe a fifth of the way through it.
Okay, all right.
I'm still reading it.
So if he does, then that would be eye-opening to me.
The rabbinic text?
Uh-huh.
Let's talk about how this kind of relates. So how would you define a near-death experience?
Well, I have nothing original to say here. I would just say what you find in all the secondary literature, which is that in the typical near-death experience, you find some combination of the following: people having an out-of-body experience where they feel that they've left their body and they can see the body down below, and then they will go through a tunnel. There will be a light at the end. The light is somehow personified. It's a being. It's loving, welcoming, and so on. Their lives will pass before their eyes, right? They'll see everything in 5 seconds. I wish somebody would write a book on this. I think it's that in and of itself is absolutely fascinating to me, how a life can flash before somebody in a second. But we have so many reports, we know that it happens. And then often you run into relatives. Often you come up against a barrier or a door or a river or something like that, and you have the choice. If you go through here, you won't come back, but you can go back. So it's very rare to have all of these in one experience. What you usually have is the memory gets 2 or 3 of these, and they can come in different orders. They're remembered in different orders. But if you put all the accounts together, these are the things that keep popping up.
Yeah, it sounds like Paul had a near-death experience. Doesn't it? Perhaps when he was stoned and thrown out of the town. He talks about going to the third heaven and
Yep. So Paul, you may like Paul for a number of reasons, but I dislike Paul for being so brief about his own life. So, we have these 3 accounts in Acts of his experience on the Damascus Road. He doesn't say anything more than he saw Jesus. It would be really nice to have a paragraph or 2 in Galatians. Yeah, this is what happened to me, right? And the same thing in 2 Corinthians, about going to the third heaven. He says just the tiniest bit. And you'd like, well, when did this happen? What occasioned it? Were you asleep? Had you been beaten? When did this happen? So, yeah, Paul's very frustrating to me.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. Who are some of your favorite NDE experts?
Well, I'm an old man now, one foot in the grave, just turned 70 last week. And I can remember when Raymond Moody's book, Afterlife, came out. So this is the mid-70s. And I read it, and I thought, this is really, really interesting. It got my attention. And then I've read everything by Raymond Moody since then. And he's written probably a dozen books related to this matter. I like him and recommend him to people because of his popular style. He's easy to read and so on. And he's pretty smart. But I recommend to people this book above all, by Bruce Greyson, who teaches or I guess he's retired now, but was at the University of Virginia in the Department of Perceptual Studies.
After.
And it's a book simply called After. Now, I think it's the only book he has written, but he's been studying this phenomenon for decades. He's probably the best informed. And the other thing is that he's written dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of articles through the years on near-death experiences. And I think most of them are probably available online. So I usually don't tell people go read Raymond Moody. I usually say read Greyson. And if you're really interested, then just go online and start reading his articles, because I think he knows more about this subject than anybody else in the world. He's made it the center of his life now for, 4 decades, 5 decades. So, yeah, those are the two names that come to mind.
Yeah, I agree. Bruce Greyson's book, After, is the one I recommend too. I think that's the best introduction to the subject that anyone has written. He does a great job in that book. In my past interview with Dr. Gregory Shushin, who's another good researcher, I asked about the polarizing ways that Christians use NDEs as an apologetic. And this is a good way to frame the next subject, since you wrote an essay on Christian interpretations of NDEs. So I think you listed 8 ways. So what are the different ways that you found that Christians respond to NDEs?
Well, off the top of my head, I might not get all 8, but roughly, so what I did is I just asked myself, what do Christian thinkers, theologians make of near-death experiences? And I discovered that some of them just ignore them completely, which baffles me at this point in time. I think it's really strange. There are some Christians who are happy to explain them away because they don't fit with their own theological expectations, right? There are those who attribute them to demons, I've discovered, which I really, really
Seraphim
find
Rose.
disgusting. There are those who say, well, this is really interesting, but we just don't know enough yet, so let's just go on and do things as we've always done them. I found a few who said, well, these are really important because they seem to falsify materialism, but that's all they did with them, right? There seems to be something here that we can't explain in terms of materialistic, reductionistic neuroscience. So there's more to the world than, many people have thought. I have found Christians who also just seem to take these accounts at face value and just say, yeah, everything's true, isn't it wonderful? And it's as though they're not critical at all. Then there are those who take them seriously but try to think in terms of culture. Why are these different now than they were in the Middle Ages? Or why are they a bit different if they come from another culture or time and place and so on? So those are some of the things that came to mind. My own view is that theologians need to pay attention, think that maybe, or I guess, to play amateur psychologist, some theologians may not be inclined to pay attention because this impinges on their territory, right? They're the ones that have always been able to speak authoritatively about what happens to you at death. And now maybe over here, we have some other voices. And wouldn't it be convenient if we didn't have to listen to them, right? Because again, we could just continue with business as usual. I don't like that. I think we're at the point where we have enough to know that something really strange is going on, that it's inexplicable in terms of today's neuroscience. There are no really good reductionistic explanations of everything that's going on. And another thing is that if you look at these accounts asking theological questions, it's dumbfounding how many people use the word God when they're talking about these accounts, telling their own experiences. And theologians should pay attention to this, right? Why are the people using the word God? We're theologians. We're about God. Where is God in these experiences? Is this all illusory? If it's not all illusory, then wow, we really do need to pay attention. So I hope I made it clear in that article there that you're referring to, that we need to pay attention. By the way, I should add, the article you're referring to was published in a book in honor of Gary Habermas. Now, Gary is a very well-known evangelical apologist, and I don't like people who are trying to turn near-death experiences into proof of Christianity. But I agree with Gary about one thing. I think if you look at the evidence fairly and open-mindedly, it does suggest that materialism is false. So that part of the apologetical program, I'm on board with. Yeah, if you think we're just chemicals and electricity, you have a problem here.
Yeah. Yeah, so much of that article you wrote really resonated with what I believe too. That's why I liked it so much. And what I find like most dumbfounding is like how little people ask that existential question of like, if this is happening today, where people are dying and meeting what they're claiming as God, and they have all these details about their experience, is it not the case that could have happened 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and like maybe this made it into religious texts?
Yeah,
like, that's kind of a big question.
So for me, actually, that's not a question. I think the answer is yes, it happened.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right? And I think this helps explain some things. So, for example, we have tons of accounts in Christian tradition and parallels in Buddhist and Hindu texts and so on, that when you die, you see an angel or you run into a being of light. You actually have this already in the Gospel of Luke, because Lazarus dies and he's carried away by angels, right? So you can find this belief all over the place. So where does it come from? Did somebody just sit around a campfire one night and said, wouldn't it be great when we die that, we see a being of light who takes us somewhere? No, I think that what is happening today was happening back then. And that's where this also, just one more illustration, people see dead relatives in these near-death experiences, but they also frequently see them right before they're dying. This is really common experience. So where does the notion of the afterlife as a reunion with relatives come from? Well, you could say, again, somebody just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could see grandma again? I think that these accounts of running into the dead, which fill world literature, dead relatives, and they're just mirrors of an experience that happens. In fact, I would guess the belief in an afterlife itself has something to do with these experiences. People thought to be dead, and then they wake up and say, oh, I wasn't dead, I was taking a trip. So, yeah, I think these things, because they happen cross-culturally now, and because they occur across religions, are part of the human experience. And much of theology is not just theologians sitting around making things up. It's people trying to decipher what has happened or trying to interpret stories that they have heard.
Exactly. I'm 100% with you. I have to talk about, like, because people will inevitably amplify the most extreme paranoid curmudgeons of any subject, usually wrongly assuming it represents discernment. So one of these kind of fundamentalist confirmation bias is found in people like Father Seraphim Rose, who will interpret all NDE information as whatever doesn't align with any particular belief that he has as an intentional, hostile, demonic attack, merely because, like I said, it's not aligned with what he believes to be true. What is your take on this? Why does this happen?
Well, I think it happens because people are insecure and they have a worldview in which everything fits comfortably, and anything that doesn't fit there, they have to explain away. But in my view, to demonize is to ignore. To demonize is to ignore. So if you could say, well, it's caused by demons, then that means we don't have to pay attention to the content of it. I would think that Christians should be nervous about this, because this is exactly what happens to Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. People say, oh, he's casting out demons. Uh-oh, that's a problem for us. What do we? Well, he must be casting them out by Beelzebul. He must be possessed. So they can ignore him because they've explained it away with demons. The thing is, you can explain everything in terms of demons. I've talked to Christians who will say, oh, my back hurts. Must be the devil today, right? They really think this. So you can invoke Satan to explain or explain away everything. I think it's lazy thinking. And again, for me, to demonize is to ignore. I read Rose's book on near-death experiences. I think it's atrocious.
Same. It's awful. He does such a disservice to the subject, because now you have a whole band of people following this line of thinking that they're being, like, I don't know, faithful to the tradition or whatever. And it's just, to me, I think it's just delusion. But this is a good segue into, we could talk about the preexistence of souls, because it's related to the subject of reincarnation, but it's not reducible to it. One could affirm the one without the other, theoretically. Many Christians early on believed in the preexistence of souls until it became kind of taboo by imperial Christianity. But you have it there in, like, Jeremiah 1:5, Ecclesiastes 12:7, Wisdom of Solomon 8:19 through 20, and John 17:5. And then St. Pamphilus of Caesarea is defending Origen's belief in the preexistence of souls against Methodius of Olympus. And so it seems like that ship on the preexistence of souls already sailed by the time Emperor Justinian comes around and wants to kind of change the perspective on that. So it sounds to me that the preexistence of souls is an unavoidable subject, but, like, what are your thoughts on this?
So you do have, Jeremiah 1 is interesting, although you could argue that's about Jeremiah in his womb rather than preexistence before that in some unembodied state. And the text from John is about Jesus. And so a traditional Christian might just say, well, that's about Jesus. It's not about the rest of us. But you're right about wisdom. It's there in wisdom, and it's there in Philo, and it's there in a book called Second Baruch, which I referred to earlier. It's in Second Enoch, which is another first century book. And the rabbis certainly know about the treasury of souls. That is, there's a place, right, where souls come from. So I would guess this was a fairly common belief or just assumption. It's not something people debated or talked about, so maybe most people didn't think about it, but once in a while, people who thought about it would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The question then becomes, why do so many people get dead set against this? Well, I don't know how to reconstruct history here, and everything has multiple causes, but as you know, Origen believed this. And there's a point at which almost everything Origen says people complain about because it's Origen. So at one point, he just becomes the bad guy. And so if he thought it, it's like it must be wrong. But there's also maybe here the fact that the dominant church is combating Gnosticism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And in Gnosticism, souls are pre-existent. They're part of the pleroma, the fullness, and then they fall into this world. And you just don't want to have anything that supports Gnosticism. So that may be another thing going on there. I don't know a particular text which says, well, we don't believe in this because the Gnostics do. But again, it's like Origen. These are the bad people. And if they believe something and it's not part of our mainstream tradition, then that's reason to wonder about it or to question it. So I think it's probably just a belief held by a number of people. It's not controversial. It becomes controversial after Origen. Nobody's saying we can't believe this before then. Now, there's another text you didn't mention, which is in John 9. I think it's John 9:2, which you must know well because it plays in the literature about Christianity and reincarnation. So, the man born blind, who sinned? This man, right? Or his parents that he was born blind? Well, how does he sin before he enters the world? Because he enters it blind. So, did he sin in the womb?
Right.
Or is there something before that? So that's a really interesting text. I've never quite figured out what to make of it, but it might just be sort of a, just a allusion to, maybe he was there before and did something wrong. And so entered, I don't know. That's an interesting text to think about.
I was going to get to that text.
Okay.
I was waiting to get there, but yeah, because that's, because that is a very important text for this subject, because I do think the reincarnation angle is the one with the most explanatory power. I think it shows that they had this idea that, many people did. Origen even talks about it. He doesn't agree with it, but he says that there were people who believed that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah. So we know there were groups of people who believed this. So to me, I don't have any problem believing that that's what people believed, because I haven't personally found any other more persuasive interpretation of that. The reason why reincarnation is an important topic to discuss, because it relates to NDEs. Because you have NDE experiencers, Dr. Ibn Alexander, the neurosurgeon, is just one of them. But there's many that when they die and they're ejected from their bodies, they find themselves suddenly washed in a greater knowledge about themselves, previously hidden from them by, you could call it, the default filters of the brain. And this often includes memories of their own previous incarnate lives whenever it becomes relevant to their current life. And the fact that this is a regularly occurring part of the human experience must provoke us modern Christians, to engage more seriously with the subject that it has previously done by, say, the church fathers or people in the past. So when Jesus is asked in John 9:2, that is the most straightforward, I think, where they're asking if the blind man has been born blind because of his sin. And then there are I would say theologically problematic passages like Malachi 1:2, which led to Paul's subsequent commentary in Romans 9:11-14, where it said that Yahweh loved Jacob and hated Esau before either were born. Having a highly negative opinion about only one of two blank slates would seem like a pretty incoherent idea. So that is one that would make more sense if reincarnation were true, since it would add at least a previous behavioral track record into the mix. And I've heard people try to justify this by saying it was the foreknowledge of Esau's life that retroactively caused the hatred, but there's really not much biblical evidence to justify such divine hatred based on what we know of Esau's life, when his only listed sins are being careless when hungry, marrying a foreign woman, wanting revenge after being cheated out of a blessing by his own mother, who loves his brother more than him. Definitely doesn't sound as bad as King David. So, and we know that Yahweh is pretty fond of him, so I'm not really convinced by the retroactive knowledge argument. But in Luke 9:19, Jesus surveys public opinion on who the townsfolk think he is. And we are given three distinct interpretations. What we're told is that some were under the impression that Jesus was actually John the Baptist, risen from the dead. I guess these are people who didn't know what John looked like. Some seem to have thought Jesus was Elijah, which means people either believed the soul of the man Elijah was reincarnated in Jesus, or that people were ignorant about Jesus being born of Mary and assumed he had no parents. Some say Jesus was a formerly deceased prophet raised from the dead. Whether this return from the dead means reanimation or reincarnation is not specified, and neither is the particular prophet. So we have a lot of gray areas there. This return of Elijah was prophesied in Malachi 4:5, which is why many first century Jews were expecting it. Though when talking about John the Baptist, Jesus said, quote, "If you're willing to accept it, John is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." He says that in Matthew 11:14. That's a curious line to me. He says, if you're willing to accept it, and then he adds at the end, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Like, that's not, to me, that's not just him saying that, like, John the Baptist has Elijah vibes, right? He's saying something a little bit more than that, it seems. What do you think?
Well, okay, there are big exegetical questions here. Now, you know, the tradition for the most part reads all these texts through Luke 1, that is spirit and power of Elijah. If Luke, well, John himself may well have thought of himself as John the Baptist in some way. Now, this is because he dresses like John the Baptist, right? So you could ask the question, does he think he's John the Baptist reincarnated, or is he trying to be like Elijah, which people can do? In some ways, Jesus, I think, tries to imitate Moses. I don't know how to respond to what you're saying here, but I would emphasize this. I think one of the problems with identifying John the Baptist with Elijah for Jesus's contemporaries would have been they're all going to think about the end of Malachi. So that's where the idea that Elijah will return comes from. So he will come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. But his purpose is to turn the hearts of right parents and children towards each other. His view is to reconcile, so to prepare for the event by fixing the problems in Israel. So that's the conception. And so if Jesus is identifying John the Baptist with that figure, whether literally or not, I think they're not going to be thinking, is he reincarnated or not? I think they're going to be thinking, but he didn't fulfill that prophecy. That is, Israel hasn't been fixed. Families aren't all reconciled. So the role that it foresaw for him, has not come to pass. So that might lie behind, if you're willing to accept it, because it's really strange. And if you look at that saying in Mark 9, he goes on immediately to talk about the Son of Man be killed, executed. He's going to die, which again is not expectation. When the Son of Man comes, it's going to be glorious and fantastic and wonderful. So maybe Jesus is saying, well, just like I'm going to die, so Elijah, it turns out, for whatever reason, died. So I don't. So we can get into exegetical weeds here, but here's the most important thing for me, and maybe you'll agree with this. I think that Christians need to think things through when the data shows that something is true. So I don't read Genesis 1, 2, and 3 literally. I know that the church tradition reads it figuratively, but it always assumes that it's also literally true, right? It assumes it's literally true. But there comes a point, a couple of centuries ago, when the theologians said, you know what, this can't be a description of history as it really was, and this is not a scientific treatise. So if we want to do our history or science, we're going to have to pay attention to cosmology and geology and anthropologists and so on. We can still theologize with Genesis, but like we have always done, but we're not going to read it as history. I think we can do the same thing and will be doing the same thing with other things. So if at some point the culture and reasonable people say, you know what, the evidence for reincarnation is in fact there, then we will rethink our tradition accordingly. Just as it's a big deal to say maybe Adam and Eve weren't historical persons, that's a big deal, right? So you can ask, how do we deal with this text? But it's not going to be just as it always was, right? So I think that this may turn out to be it's not just as it always was. And once we do that, then we will go back and read our texts accordingly. And we may be doing things like you're doing right now. But maybe this Elijah thing is more literal than we thought. But for me, the thing you don't want to do is be an empiricist denier. So we still have people who think the world is 6,000 years old and who take everything in Genesis completely literally. I can't do that because I think empirical research has made that impossible. So if empirical research at some point convinces me as a Christian or as a theologian that reincarnation is true, then I am forced to look at things in that light, just as I'm forced to read the Bible now with the idea that Genesis isn't a science textbook. All right. Does that make sense? So that's actually my main concern in the matter, which means my main concern at this point isn't exegetical. My main concern at this point is, what do we do with the ostensible evidence for reincarnation? Because some of it you can't laugh away, in my judgment, right? If you go back and read Ian Stevenson, so you asked me who my favorite reincarnation researchers were. So Ian Stevenson is my least favorite. Now, he was in many ways the most competent, but he thought of himself as a scientist. That was his self-conception. And if you read what he has to say, these are boring field reports. They're boring, boring, boring. They have no literary flair or interest at all. They're
very dry, very dry.
They're just boring. But if you take the time to read through them, you will end up at, like whichever book, what was it, 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. You will scratch your head at some of these and say, if he isn't lying, what do we do here, right? So at some point, you get enough of these. And I think at this point, we have enough from near-death experiences for me to say, okay, I need to think in these terms. This is real, and I have to take this into account. With reincarnation, part of my problem is that I don't like it. I don't want to be reincarnated. I want to go on. I'm tired of this world. I just want to go on. But also, I have so many friends who would just laugh if they were to listen to this and say, why isn't Dale just laughing at this guy because he's talking about reincarnation, right? So, there's also maybe a sense of social pressure that people, he's lost his mind because it doesn't fit the current scientific worldview. My problem is I have read some of these accounts, and right now I think I have two choices. So one choice is reincarnation. Well, I have three choices. One choice is reincarnation. Two is all these cases are just fabricated, they're lies, and so on. But that's not true. All right. Jim Tucker, for example, who's doing a lot of work now, is a serious guy. He doesn't have a religious agenda. He really thinks of himself as a scientist. He's trying to get at the truth. He's not lying. He's just not lying. So the other option I'm left with, because that's not an option, is, well, maybe there's a giant library in the sky and it records all of us. And then once in a while, somebody unconsciously checks out a book about somebody's life and then they absorb it somehow. You get access to not all knowledge, but you get access weirdly somehow to somebody's volume of memories. Now, I don't know what sense that makes, but at this point, I think those are our two options, right? And so I probably won't resolve that before I go on. But at this point, I think reincarnation is a credible, reasonable explanation for a lot of data. And it doesn't mystify me that reincarnation has been popular in all sorts of times and places, right? Again, I don't think Plato believed it just because he wanted to make it up. I think behind this idea are stories. So again, if people are remembering past lives in the here and now, in modern American culture, in families where it doesn't have a place, where it just shows up, right? A 3-year-old kid raised as a Baptist starts talking about reincarnation. It doesn't make any sense. So this must have happened other times and places, and that's why we have this belief. So my main concern personally is to figure this out for myself. But then I don't know what to make of theologians. So you may be more optimistic than I am, but maybe they just want to do business as always and they'll ignore this as long as possible. I remember once I was writing a book and I was going to list reincarnation as an option about something. It was one of the options for A, B, C, and D. And he's a theologian, he's a Barthian, he's a dear friend, and he said, you just can't say that. Reincarnation is a bridge too far. We can't think that. It's outside of our tradition. And so there's a lot of prejudice or bigotry here, and maybe it can be fought and overcome. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. I think the theologians are just going to continue to do what they've always done and ignore Jim Tucker's cases and Ian Stevenson's cases and near-death experiences. So I hope you're younger than I am. I hope you can see people, professional theologians, who actually at some point wake up and say, we need to think about this. By the way, one more thing, and then I'll shut up. When theologians don't address these questions, they're being stupid and they're shrinking their audience, because people in the pews and people in the culture are reading books on reincarnation. They are reading books and watching shows on near-death experiences. And in fact, if you look at the polls, more people in North America, when they think about the afterlife, think of near-death experiences and reincarnation before they use resurrection language. So in the popular thought, they've already displaced our traditional Christian language and thinking. Theologians are irresponsible if they don't pay attention, seems to me. They're making themselves irrelevant.
I agree. Two things from what you said. The first one is tongue-in-cheek. Can you promise me that after you die, you're going to send me a visit and let me know what's going on over there? All right, number two, the third option you said, I think I should spend some time on that, because that's not a throwaway option. When you said the whole, like, you put it like a library in the sky.
Yeah.
But there is a real experience. I don't know if it's probably not so much a library as it is an ontological connection with all souls, where there's many people who have NDEs and they experience themselves from the perspective of somebody that they've harmed.
Yep.
And so that is like a recurring theme in a lot of these. And so there is this idea of, and like that happens with somebody not saying that they were that person in a previous life or anything like that. So the phenomenology of that is like, there is a real experience of being able to live events in this life from the vantage point of other people and them not being you. The difficulty is if reincarnation is true, it's very hard to distinguish between those two things. Maybe it's just something that is intuitively known by the experiencer and you can't really objectively make that distinction. I don't know. But it would be really hard for somebody who's like on the outside looking in at experiencers to be able to distinguish, is this person that they have memories of them in a previous life, or is it somebody that they're just connected to somehow?
Yeah. You could also theoretically think in terms not of reincarnation, but in terms of possession. So you could think in terms of a soul entering somebody and becoming the dominant of multiple personalities, right? Who has access to what others say, but is now there. So yeah, it can get really strange, right? But again, my point would be, no matter how strange it is, there are things to look into here, right? There are things to look into.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of, like, we're speaking metaphysically around a particular subject that I think rarely ever gets like directly addressed. And that is the nature of daimons, demons, all of this. You say in your book concerning the problem of evil, you said, quote, maybe God's not the only reality beyond our earthly cave. Maybe additional powers exist and not all of them friendly. And that's true. Can you explain the nature and definition of the Greek word daimon as defined and understood by the ancient Greek world? Because like this was dominated by culturally defining figures like Hesiod and Plato, and In Hesiod, in Works and Days 121 to 123, a daimon is defined as a benevolent, discarnate spirit. That is, one that once lived a life of fleshly embodiment, but nonetheless still operates on earth to positively influence the next generations. Essentially, the role of an angel in Jewish and Greek and Christian cosmology. Plato explicitly names Hesiod in Cratylus 398 and agrees that when a good man dies, he becomes a daimon, but also adds that a good man is a daimon regardless of whether they're incarnate or not, because it concerns the eternal nature of spirit in both modalities. So the definition of daimon as synonymous with spirit would explain why daimon is often translated in English as spirit. The New Testament shows that daimons were also not always defined to be categorically benevolent or malevolent in the tradition of Hesiod, but are just as morally ambiguous as humans. This would also explain why in Greek there exist words with inherent moral qualifiers like agathodaimon, which means good demon, and kakodaimon, which means bad demon. And you rightly note in your book on Jesus' resurrection that the first century church father Ignatius of Antioch in the epistle to the Smyrnians, probably maybe quoting perhaps a paraphrased version of Jesus' post-resurrection words. He says, quote, "Lay hold and handle me and see that I am not a bodiless daimon," to argue that Jesus still had a corporeal body even after he rose from the dead. Our manuscript versions of that passage use the Greek word pneuma, usually translated spirit, instead of daimon. But knowing in our modern English world, ghost and spirit are English synonyms. Ghost coming from the German Geist, spirit coming from the Latin spiritus. And the evidence seems to suggest that daimon and pneuma are ancient Greek synonyms. Would you agree? What do you think about this?
Well, so that's a lot. So what you're looking at when you're looking at this Greek word is what you find with lots of words, or maybe most words, that words have a history. And you could say that this began this way, and then it became multiple things. Even for, I guess now everybody uses the internet, so they don't know this anymore. But I still have in my office one of the old giant Webster's. I mean, it's this thick, right? And if you look up any significant noun, there is never one meaning for it. It's never one meaning. You frequently will find 6 meanings or 7 meanings. And then if you're an historian, an etymologist, you could sometimes say, okay, here's the evolution of this word. It originally meant this, and then it came to mean that. So you could do a similar history. You could do that sort of history with daimon. So originally it appears to mean something like divinity or God or goddess. And then at some point it comes to mean the heroes of old, or the spirits of the heroes of old. And then at some point it becomes the spirits of good people. So it evolves, and it can mean many different things. In Plato, his daimon is his, we would say, conscience, but he talks of it as his theos, his God. The God said, but it's his demon that's saying this, right? So I think what happens to lead up to what we find in the New Testament is that, for a reason I don't understand, in Judaism, demon becomes more and more a negative term. You can see this in the Septuagint. So the translators of the Septuagint, that's the Greek version, pre-Christian Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, they translated it into Greek. There seems to be a tendency towards a sort of dualism. So the good beings that help people, they all become angeloi, they become angels. So they're good. And then bad spirits, bad things, they get to be demons. Now, I don't know why this is the case, but you can see a very strong tendency towards demon becoming a bad word in the Septuagint. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, it's almost exclusively in Jewish and Christian context a negative word. I think in Acts, there's one point in Acts, maybe Acts 17, where it still has the old meaning of divinity. It doesn't mean demon. Luke's preserving an old use of this term. But at some point after the Septuagint, we get this bifurcation, right? And now that's the word history. My own personal theological take on this is that this is problematic because I think that whatever invisible world is there is probably as complex and weird as our world, and that there's probably a spectrum of everything. So I would say, to use the traditional language, that there are, or maybe the language you want to use, there are good demons and bad demons. They're probably smart demons and dumb demons, right? I don't like what the tradition has done here with all invisible spirits are angels or demons. They're really, really good or they're really, really rotten. This sort of dualism is also what lies behind heaven and hell. We're either in heaven or we're in hell, and that's it. There's no nuance. But I think whatever is out there is probably complex. There are, I am sure, spirits that are benevolent and correspond to saints, and there are also evil, malevolent things. But I also think there are just mischievous things and inexplicable things and ugly things and everything along the spectrum. So when we sort of followed the Septuagint and everything became angel or demon, I think that excludes us from being able to think about things that are in between or are not obviously one or the other. But this does already begin to happen in pre-Christian Judaism, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of doing the same thing. I want to get away from this very simplistic angel demon narrative that really isn't helpful and doesn't actually describe reality. Because like it doesn't account for, like, the way I joke about it is like the 14-year-old McDonald's worker with a temper who dies and becomes a dime. Like, where does that person fit in the angel or demon category? And like even the old definitions of defining it as a god or whatever. Well, that's not a metaphysical claim. That's really not saying anything metaphysically. A god could be, any kind of modality. So that's also not very helpful. So I think the best modern example of really what was trying to like get at in the ancient world of what this word means is what Ian Stevenson uses, which is discarnate. And the modern parapsychological term discarnate is also generic. It doesn't imply any moral statements about the type of spirit it is, but it's also factoring in something metaphysical. So I think that's probably the best option.
Well, so that's something that they all have in common, all these different ideas, discarnate, right? So that makes sense. But you would also have to recognize that in certain sources or branches of literature, you will see the word used in particular ways, such as consistently negative in certain Jewish and Christian works.
Right. And like you said, they changed in the Septuagint, they changed uses of the word like gods to angels. And then you have in like the book of Tobit, you have this dualistic picture of like the archangels versus Asmodeus. And so it does get very, very dualistic pretty quickly. But yeah, I just think that's just a subject that doesn't really get discussed. It's like people just like assume this metaphysical like framework without ever really investigating it seems. Is that something in your experience?
Well, yeah. So that's part of what I was complaining about earlier. People are just handed in the churches angels and demons, and then they try to go through life interpreting everything in terms of angels and demons. And it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. I much prefer the Middle Eastern notion that there are also jinns, for example. There are, weird things that happen, and we just attribute them to spirits that aren't evil or good. They're just mischievous or whatnot. So I like that there's another category, but we need multiple categories, if you will.
Something I noticed immediately in reading your book is how we have that same kind of pastoral agenda that seeks to defend ridiculed experiencers that are wrongly ridiculed. Despite neither of us being clerics, I like the way you titled your final chapter, The Pastoral Imperative. Do you think about anyone close to you in particular when you see somebody being, cynical or dismissive about all these kinds of experiencers?
Sure. So, first of all, people should not be ridiculed for things that they experience and things that they do not believe they did to themselves. So I remember one morning, my daughter got up and she told me, "Dad, this just happened." And I'm not going to relate the details, but it was a horrific experience with beings that weren't exactly demons, but they were very frightening and very scary. It was a terrible, bizarre experience. It was out of the blue. It wasn't scripted. It didn't fit anything that she knew. But because she knew who I was, she shared it to me. But then she said, "Daddy, you can't tell anyone because they'll think I'm crazy." That's the sentence. They'll think I'm crazy. Well, she's not crazy. She has told me that she experienced a PTSD for 10 years, a decade after this experience. It would come back to her and she'd be terrified. Now, she didn't do this, and she didn't make it up. And from one point of view, it doesn't matter metaphysically how you explain it or explain it away. It happened to her. It was real. And to make fun of her or for her to think I can't tell anyone because they'll think I'm crazy is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. So I think that much of our world is dishonest in the sense that it doesn't give people permission to talk about things that are really, really important to them. I also remember a woman, this is quite a while ago now, who was a church administrator. Back then, we would have called her a secretary. She met me, and I can't remember why she knew who I was, but she proceeded to give me a traditional near-death experience, right, to talk about this. And she said she met God, and she said it was the most important thing in her life. Now, it's so far away, I cannot remember whether she said one of two things. Either she said, "I've not told anyone, including my husband," or "You're the only person beside my husband that I've told." But it was either one or two people. She met God, center of her spiritual life. She lived in a church. She was an administrator. She was there with pastors and church people all day long. Never talked to them about it. But found me, somehow learned that I had an open mind and I wouldn't make fun of her. And then the story came out. Just 2 months ago, I was giving a workshop on end-of-life experiences, things that happen around deathbeds, and a woman came up afterwards. She was in her 60s. She gave me a traditional near-death experience that happened to her 40 years ago, and she said, "You're the first person I've ever told." So how weird a world in which people are walking around with these experiences that are profound to them, that mean a lot to them, and nobody can acknowledge them. It's also a real problem for some people who have experience of what's called sleep paralysis, when they wake up and they can't move and they're terrified and they think they're going to die and they can't breathe. And very often there's this weird evil presence, usually down to the left by their feet. Sometimes takes the form of a smoky black something. Well, I have run into people for whom this has been a repeated experience, and they're traumatized by it, and they have no idea, none, that this happens to 20% of North Americans at the present time over the course of a lifetime. 1 out of 5 has this. Doctors have studied it, and it happens to people, and because of the world that we live in, they don't know that there are counselors for this, or people to talk to, or books to read on this. They just live to themselves because this is somehow a secret. So I think the world is full of way more secrets than we know. And I think religious experience is a really important part of that. So it really bugs me when something happens to people and it either traumatizes them or it has to do with God and they're just stuck on their own. So maybe that's the main reason I wrote the book that you referred to, Encountering Mystery, because these experiences are everywhere, but talking about them is not everywhere.
That's a good answer. In Plato's allegory of the cave, it's, I think, rooted in his conclusion to the Republic, which is the story of the soldier heir who returns from death to tell of his experience, and that the allegory of the cave is the implication of that NDE, where death is what initiates the journey out of the cave of shadows, which is the corporeal, material plane of ignorance and darkness, and into the spiritual realm of light and knowledge, where the true forms of all things reside. This means that for Plato, our theorizing about the metaphysical nature of reality must be rooted in human experience. And to dismissively discount human testimony like NDEs as irrelevant to constructing a Christian cosmology is setting people up to have a cosmology that does not even correspond to reality. What do you think about this?
Well,
I think we talked a little bit about it already, but...
So, yeah, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I believe in what a scholar named David Hufford has called the experiential source hypothesis. So if you want to understand where religious ideas come from, you look at experiences. So you could say, well, people believe in heaven, in a paradise, because they want to. But that's not the correct explanation. The correct explanation is that people in multiple states of consciousness have these experiences of otherworldly places that are wonderful. It's just true. And you could ask, well, why do people believe in hell? Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if our enemies just burned up? But the correct explanation is people have hellish experiences when they come close to death once in a while, and it gets reported, and then we theologize about that. Going to something specific, Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. It's not some sort of empty theological, hey, wouldn't it be nice? People had experiences. I think that there was a report of an empty tomb, and then people ran into this guy. And then theologizing about resurrection grows out of reflections on these experiences. So I think experience is everywhere within theology. You can't separate theology from experience. And to ignore experience is to leave theology just sort of floating off by itself in the air. And that's historically, that just doesn't make any sense to me. So, yeah, I guess I'm agreeing with you here.
Yeah. I have a couple of audience questions to conclude with. My friend Alex writes, this kind of relates to what you said. What do you make of the NDEs of people who experience suffering and torment of hell as described by mystics in the Catholic tradition, or even those who have no faith at all?
Yeah. So I should say that I'm an Origenist, and so I am a Universalist, but that doesn't make me deny that people have hellish experiences. My own approach to this, right or wrong, is to view this as a pastoral problem. So when tragedy or terrible things happen to people, you can respond by saying, well, you must have done something wrong. God is punishing you. You sinned, and therefore you have cancer. Now, my wife actually grew up in a fundamentalist circle that would talk like that. When something bad happened, they would come up with a simple explanation. My view is that we need to sympathize with such people. We need to do what we can to encourage and help them, not deny their experience, but we don't sort of, so to speak, say, well, you caused this and this is your eternal fate and blah, blah, blah. So I view it as something akin to other horrific experiences. And I'm cheered, by the way, as you must know, there are some reports of near-death experiences that begin hellish and then move in to, the more wonderful thing. So I kind of like that. I also know that people can experience the same thing very, very differently. And phenomenologically, some of these experiences that are hellish sound formally like what's happening with people who are enjoying them. And I sometimes wonder, is it possible to be in the same place, and have totally radically different experiences? So that might have something to do with it.
curiously related to St. Isaac of Nineveh, calling the fires of hell the love of God.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Sometimes I'll tell my students about a rock artist, a guitarist that I love, and I go to his concerts. I've seen him many times. And I am in seventh heaven, right, when I'm listening to him. But if you were to take my old cousin Vera, who is much older than I am and likes nothing but classical music, she would hear nothing but noise. Her ears would hurt. She would be in pain. She would be in a sort of hell, right? If she were sitting up by the speaker and she could make nothing of it. And I'm there just in bliss. So you can have the very same experience, but depending, you can be in the very same place, but depending on who you are and what you bring. So that's a sort of homey analogy to what Isaac.
You should title your playlist Vera's Hell.
Yeah.
Dominic D'Souza writes, are there any indicators that ancient Hebrews or Jews have once operated within a reincarnation context that we no longer recognize?
Apart from things we've discussed today, I don't know of anything beyond that. Pardon?
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't know if there's anything to add to that.
I just don't know.
And he has a couple more questions. What questions or ideas in the gospel answer differently when set in a reincarnation context?
Well, so you were illustrating that today. You're trying to do the Elijah and John the Baptist material from that point of view. So that would be obvious. But my answer besides that is that the Gospel of John clearly has a pre-existent Jesus. And then 9:2 suggests or raises that possibility for Lazarus. So it would be very interesting to read the Gospel of John on the assumption that preexistence is not just something for Jesus. What would happen if you did that? I don't know, but it occurs that would be something to think about anyway.
And if reincarnation were true, why would Jesus cry at Lazarus' death? That's an interesting question.
That's what we do when people die. Even if you believe in reincarnation, it hurts when your father or friend or spouse or child dies. So you can go to a fundamentalist Baptist church that's having a funeral and somebody has died and everybody there thinks, oh, this person is with Jesus. They're all crying anyway because they miss this person, right? So, for me, death is not extinction, but it is separation. And I desperately miss certain people that I can no longer talk to or hug or see. It's really hard sometimes, right? And it's terribly hard in the days immediately afterwards. So, of course, Jesus is going to weep. This is his friend.
Have you ever read Johann Christoph Hanf, his To Die Is Gain?
Yeah,
book?
I have that book. Yeah.
Something that really clicked when I read that was that, because he kind of phrases it as like, death is death only to the living. It's like the people who die are not the ones that are crying.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are relieved. It's us who remain that are the ones who have to feel the pain of death.
Yeah. And we do feel it.
I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
So for me, that's not a theoretical or theological question. It's just, this is what happens to human beings when beloved ones die. Just a fact.
Yeah. Well, Dale, I want to really thank you for agreeing to this conversation. And I think there's a lot of people that are going to really enjoy it. So I appreciate you setting aside time to do it.
Well, you're quite welcome. Good questions. And fun to talk about weird things.
Yeah, as it always is.